Thank you, everybody. It will be half an hour of presentation, 10 minutes of questions after each presentation. So speakers, please, I know there's so much to talk about, but let's keep it prompt in some ways. Okay, so first off, Keith Frankish, professor of something or other, University of Sheffield, University of Crete, and he's talking, what are you talking about? Oh yes, how to think about artificial consciousness. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Καλώς ορίσατε στο Ηράκλειο. This is where I live. This is my hometown. So it's, although I'm not responsible for the conference, I'd like to welcome you here. Okay, so this is a photograph taken 11 years ago during the cruise in Greenland, kindly organized by Mimicry, which was certainly a major event in my life and a very memorable event, I think, for everyone who was there. Two people, this is me while I still had hair. Generally, I'm exploring the hypothesis that there's a correlation between the amount of hair and the amount of belief in qualia. The two other people here, I'm sure, are well known to you. This, of course, is Dan Dennett, and this is Nick Humphrey. And we're playing Frigate Bird, word game, at which Dan and Nick were vastly better than I was. Dan, sadly, is no longer with us, though I'm sure his influence is strongly present here in the room. Nick, I'm glad to say, is here, and he's going to speak immediately after me. So I'm not going to steal any of Nick's thunder. I agree with Nick on many, many things, and he's been a big influence on me. But I'll try to give a more Dennettian talk just now. I can't do it with the wit and erudition and just the wonderful presence that Dan that Dan would have done, but I think I hope the message is one he would approve. So how to think about artificial consciousness. I'll begin with some spoilers. That's it. Okay, so really I can stop now. Don't think about it. Not because it's dangerous or unethical to create artificial consciousness, though it may well be, but that's not the reason I'm going to concentrate on. I don't think it's a coherent project at all. I think there are lots of interesting projects in this vicinity, which is worth pursuing, but the idea of trying to create, saying we're going to sit down, we're going to create a program, we're going to design a program to create artificial consciousness, that isn't feasible. Caveats are always caveats. Plan, I'm going to introduce two paradigms, which I'm going to call the Cartesian and the post-Cartesian. This is designed to annoy pretty much everyone in the room in one way or another by lumping everyone into one of two categories. I'm going to do it all the same. I'm going to then discuss the Cartesian perspective. Cartesian perspective on artificial consciousness, and then the post-Cartesian perspective on artificial consciousness, and then we'll have the conclusion, which you've already heard. Two paradigms. I thought I'd include a picture of this fellow. This is also taken from the Greenland conference. I have his permission to use it. This is Philip Goff, my pal and sparring partner, who is very definitely a proponent of the Cartesian paradigm. I think you all know what I'm talking about by the Cartesian paradigm. The idea is that consciousness consists in possession of phenomenal properties, or in having experiences that possess phenomenal properties. These properties are intrinsic. Difficult word to elucidate, as Dan liked to point out, but let's understand that as they cannot be characterized in functional terms. Cannot be characterized in terms of the performance of certain functions, in terms of what they do. They're taken to be irreducibly subjective. Irreducibly is important here because there's there's a perfectly good way in which post-Cartesians can talk about subjective things. Irreducibly subjective means accessible only to the subject, not publicly observable or characterizable in third-person terms. And to that subject, they are immediately and certainly known, with again with caveats. In the right conditions, they're certainly known. So the upshot is that consciousness is a private mental world where phenomenal properties are directly revealed to a self or subject. The nature of that self or subject is generally underspecified, if specified at all. This kind of consciousness is sometimes called phenomenal consciousness, in contrast to other kinds. If you're a proponent of this paradigm, then the central problem you face is the hard problem of explaining phenomenal properties, a term, of course, famously coined by David Chalmers. There seems to be, well, there's bound to be an explanatory gap between neuroscientific facts and phenomenal facts. There must be a gap between irreducibly subjective facts and ones that aren't, or irreducibly subjective properties and ones that aren't, I should say. And so a scientific account of consciousness is going to have to be supplemented by a metaphysical theory of how the public world of brain processes that science can study is related to this irreducibly subjective world of phenomenal properties. Okay? The post-Cartesian paradigm, a little swirl here, that's a little nod to Nick. Nick will understand why that's there. Little maze or spiral, which we find everywhere. What did I do? What happened there? Press the wrong button. It's just the denial of that. Okay, so conscious experiences are functional states, which can be characterized in terms of the causal role they play within a cognitive system. Fully characterized, nothing left out in terms of what they do. Now, of course, this role may be extremely complex and fine-grained. It's not something we can just articulate by conceptual analysis. Quite a lot of experimental work to tease out the nature of this role, and it may involve processes at a very, very fine-grained level. But it's still a causal role. It's a matter of what things do. So very roughly, we could say something like this, that sensory information is conscious when it's available to a wide range of brain systems and generates a wide range of reactions and reactive dispositions, including, perhaps crucially, higher order ones. That's kind of like the most general possible statement of this paradigm. Every theory within this paradigm will spell that out in different ways. So, for example, an experience is conscious when it produces the right range of beliefs, evokes a wide range of memories, triggers associations, initiates emotional responses, primes certain behavioral responses, has a whole range of effects, becomes famous within the brain, within the cognitive system, as Dan liked to put it. And that's what consciousness consists in. It consists in a complex of informational and reactive processes. Those information reactive processes don't cause consciousness. They produce it. It doesn't emerge from them. It is them. So in this view, there are no phenomenal properties, only the psychological illusion of them. We are convinced that they exist when we introspect. Well, at least some of us are. Some of us aren't. I mean, Pete Mandic isn't at all. But they don't actually exist. So there's no hard problem, no explanatory gap. Instead, the crucial question instead of the hard problem, how does the brain generate phenomenal properties, we have the hard question, what Dan called the hard question. What difference does consciousness make? What causal difference does it make when a bit of information becomes conscious? And this view is it never had a really settled term, qualia eliminativism, I suppose. But the name illusionism has caught on. And Dan endorsed that, which helped. So let's look at artificial consciousness. How am I doing for time? How am I doing? Hurry up, Keith. How much time have I spent? Cartesian perspective. Well, how do you approach making artificial consciousness on this view? How do you design it? To design a machine, you need to provide a functional description of what you want the machine to do, and then devise mechanisms that implement that, that perform those functions. We have a rough idea how to do that with many mental capacities. But we can't do it with consciousness, because consciousness, in this sense, on the Cartesian paradigm, can't be characterized in terms of its function. Conscious experiences just intrinsically feel a certain way. Maybe some people say, maybe we could provide a description of the intrinsic structure of consciousness and implement that, thinking of people in the IIT camp. Still, I still don't see how you get from structure to feel. Maybe they can implement structural features of consciousness, and they've got stories about that, but still don't see how you get from that to feel. And the following objections apply anyway. So the hard problem generates the hard project. Hard project of creating a machine that has consciousness. If you have a hard problem of explaining consciousness, then you have a hard project of creating it. Well, you might say, well, okay, maybe we can't set out to design it in that way, but we could at least replicate it. I mean, we have examples of things that are conscious. Us, at least. Why can't we just take them as our model? Well, we still have a problem. What exactly are we going to replicate? The idea is that we identify the brain systems that produce consciousness in us, the neural correlates of consciousness, and then we just replicate them artificially. Okay? Well, first of all, there's going to be a serious methodological problem in identifying the neural correlates of consciousness. After all, we can't experimentally detect consciousness in other people, phenomenal properties in other people. And I would say even in ourselves, there's a problem. I'll get into that another time. All we can really do is identify the brain systems that produce the reactions we associate with consciousness. We can harmlessly disrupt certain brain regions with transcranial magnetic stimulation, for example, and see if the subject still says they can see the stimulus, taking their report as a reliable marker of the presence of conscious experience. So we're not going to identify the neural correlates of consciousness, we're going to identify the neural correlates of the behavioral correlates of consciousness and replicate those. That's the best we can do. And that just assumes certain correlations between behavior and consciousness. Okay, we all have ideas about what those correlations might be, common sense ones, but most theories of consciousness involve our giving up some of those. So, not clear how we're going to get there. And we can never be sure that the disruptions that we're doing are really disrupting consciousness rather than just disrupting the reactions that we assume go with it. So maybe when you disrupt a certain part of the brain, the subject says, I can't see it anymore. But maybe they are still having a conscious experience, and what we've disrupted is their ability to report that they're seeing it. You can never check that they really are having a conscious experience. Even the subject can't be sure, since we may be disrupting their ability to remember that they saw the stimulus a moment ago. Maybe they saw it, had a conscious experience of it, and then that vanished because of the disruption. This is a point that Dan would have made much more forcefully and elegantly, and probably with a fantastic thought experiment. Okay, well, let's suppose we could identify the neural correlates. Despite those problems, we'd still have a problem. At what level of detail would we have to replicate those brain systems that we decided produce consciousness in us? Would we just have to replicate the functions they perform? But if so, which functions exactly? Any particular brain system is likely to have more than one single function. And the brain's complicated and interconnected. Would we have to replicate their functions and their internal informational structure of the processes involved, as IIT people think? Would we have to replicate those functions and perhaps the internal structure using the same biological materials? Is there something special about biological materials that is crucial to producing consciousness? Would we have to replicate quantum processes within the biological materials as orchestrated objective reduction people like Stuart Hameroff suggest? Well, the point is we need a metaphysical theory of consciousness. We can't just set out to do this project without having a metaphysical theory of consciousness. A theory of how the public world that we can describe and manipulate and replicate is related to the private, irreducibly subjective world of consciousness. And there is lots of disagreement among theorists, lots and lots. My pal Philip thinks the entire universe is conscious. And there's no way of empirically testing these theories, absolutely none. All we have are intuitions about theoretical economy, elegance, and so on. Finally, how to tell if we succeeded? After all, we can't detect phenomenal properties directly. There's no conceptual link between the properties we can detect and phenomenal properties. They can't be defined in third-person terms. They can't be, they're not functional properties. Suppose we create a robot that displays all of the reactions, the behavioral correlates of consciousness. So it says it's conscious, it believes it's conscious, it even claims that its experiences have mysterious phenomenal properties that it can't possibly be explained in third-person terms. It's a convinced Cartesian. We still couldn't be sure that it really was conscious. Maybe it's just a zombie. Maybe that's all we've created. We can never tell. We can't set out to design consciousness, and though we might succeed in replicating it, more or less by accident, because we don't know which of the metaphysical theories is true, we still couldn't be sure we'd succeeded. So really, even though we might succeed, kind of by accident, we couldn't say that we've completed the project. I mean, writing the report on your grant proposal to describe your degree of success is going to be a nightmare. So I say just forget it and do something else. If you're a Cartesian. Okay, what about a post-Cartesian perspective? Obviously, I'm getting there. You might think I'm going to say, well, this will be a lot easier. Well, in some ways it would. Certainly feasible in principle if consciousness is constituted by a cluster of informational and reactive processes, information sensitivities and reactive dispositions, and they can all be fully characterized in functional terms, then we could do it. We just need to build the right mechanisms to implement those functions. So in David's terms, it's an easy project, one that can be characterized in functional terms, though a fiendishly difficult one. Dan liked to say that they've got the name labels the wrong way around, that the easy problem was the hard one, the hard problem was the easy one. So, I've just said that. It's feasible in principle. We just have to identify the relevant processes and design mechanisms to implement them. And if we're aiming to create human-like consciousness, this will probably involve implementing higher-order introspective sensitivities. I'm sure this is something that Nick, reactive dispositions rather, this is something Nick will talk about. The trouble is it's not a well-defined project. Which informational sensitivities and which reactive dispositions exactly are crucial? I think that's a bad question. I think Dan would say bad question. Because there's no single answer. Remember, consciousness isn't something created by the right cluster of functional properties. Get the right set of functional processes and bang, the consciousness light comes on. It's not like that. It just is a cluster of functional processes. different in different creatures. So creating consciousness per se cannot be a goal. You have to say what kind of consciousness you mean. Now, I think Nick will disagree with that, but that's because he has a story about what kind of consciousness we're interested in, the kind that's important for sentience. A better question is this: which kind of consciousness do we want to create? The kind that we have, the kind that octopuses have, the kind that dogs have, the kind that perhaps very simple creatures might have. Evolution didn't select for consciousness. That's a crucial point. It selected for specific sensory capacities and reactive dispositions, including, in humans, capacities for psychological self-monitoring. That's what it selected for. And we call the result consciousness. It's a folk psychological term. How much use is it? If you want to argue that it is useful, then you need to give me a robust substantive account of exactly what functions consciousness performs. And there may be lots of interesting accounts in that area. But arguing whether that is an account of consciousness seems to me just terminological. Nick's got a very interesting account of the role that certain sorts of evaluative response play, and I think that's a very interesting account. Whether it's an account of conscience or not doesn't matter, as far as I can see. It's an account of something very important for the creatures that possess it. But you might say, if that's right, then how will we tell if our machine is conscious? If there's no single thing that constitutes consciousness? Well, again, that's a bad question. You'll never make the machine phenomenally conscious, because if you're post-Cartesian, you deny that phenomenal consciousness exists, the irreducibly subjective world. And you'll inevitably make it functionally conscious to some degree if you equip it with complex informational sensitivities and reactive dispositions. Fame in the brain, very, very loose notion. Which brain? Which kind of brain? The brain of which kind of creature? A better question is, how conscious is it? In what way is it conscious? How similar are its sensitivities and reactive dispositions to ours? And we can answer that by mapping our sensitivities and reactive dispositions and comparing them to those of the machine we've created. You might want to say at this point, I've got 2 more slides and I'll be done. I don't want to incur the wrath of the moderator. You may be saying, well, okay, that sounds very... You seem to have removed the mystery from it, but you've also dismantled this notion of consciousness, and isn't that notion central to our thinking about whether other creatures have intrinsic ethical value, whether they matter? Well, and indeed you might say, how could anything have intrinsic ethical value if it lacks phenomenal consciousness? Again, bad questions. I keep wanting to say that in Dan's voice. Bad question. What it's like to be a creature, as we ordinarily use that term, isn't determined by a private phenomenal essence. I'm not denying that it's okay to talk about creatures as, to ask what it's like to be an octopus, say. I think there's a perfectly good sense in which we can ask that, but we're not referring to some irreducibly subjective mental world that we can never access. What it's like to be a creature is determined by how things affect it, what it's sensitive to, and how it responds to the things that it's sensitive to, how it responds psychologically. If you're concerned for the welfare of a creature, of another creature, study how things affect it. What matters to it, and how does it matter? I make the case for that in this paper, which is open access. Okay, we're at the conclusion, which you already know. Don't think about it. don't think about making your machine. Don't sit down and say, let's design a conscious machine. That's borderline incoherent project, at least without specifying a lot of, coming up with a lot of artificial definitions of consciousness. You need, before you can create artificial consciousness, you need an artificial definition of consciousness. Huh, I like that, I just thought of that. Think about what you want your machine to do and how you can get it to do it. What goals should your machine have? What things should it be sensitive to in the world and how should it react to them? Reaction is central to this. This is something that Nick has taught me, something I think that Dan didn't perhaps give enough emphasis to. Evaluative response is central to this loose thing we call consciousness. And I just wish everyone would listen to Nick about that because it's so important. If you like, I see Dan as demolishing a bad idea of consciousness, a bad paradigm. That's not enough. You've got to start building a new one within this post-Cartesian framework. And that is something that Nick has done wonderful pioneering work on. And I'm going to mention his book, Soul Dust. Again, it's one of my favorite books. The first chapter just demolishes the Cartesian paradigm. This is obviously going nowhere. Then the rest of the book starts on a rich and wonderful account of how we can have all the wonder of consciousness within a post-Cartesian framework. Not sure if Nick would like imposing that framework on him, but I think he'd be okay with it. He'll tell me if not. What sensory, learning, reasoning, and evaluative capacities does it need? Evaluative again. What degree of autonomy does it need? Again, all these things are connected as well. Autonomy is a matter of having the right kind of self-control, evaluative capacities for self-control. Does it need introspective capacities of some kind? If so, what kind? Etc., etc., etc. All of these are the questions you should be asking. You don't need to, the word consciousness doesn't need to appear. I mean, I could have slides and slides of these questions. This is the moral. You look after the functions and let consciousness look after itself. Let me show you things.
It's a great honor and pleasure to have Nick with us. Nick Humphrey, Emeritus Professor of Psychology with the London School of Economics. And he's going to be talking on the Mirage of Sentient AI. Thank you.
So that was the title I gave a long time ago, and I thought I'd stick with it. It's a bit difficult. Keith just said he hoped he didn't set me up. Well, he did, and I'm not going to take up the challenge. I'm actually not going to talk about my own theories of consciousness much at all. A few months ago, Michael Pauen and Keith and I asked, what should this first session be about? And we converged on the idea that really what we need to discuss is what's at issue here. What is the question when we talk about whether AI is sentient or conscious or whatever other words we tend to use? And I thought I'd use my time to actually go back to basics. I'm sorry if it seems a bit elementary, some of it, but I think we do need a tutorial about what are the issues which we want to address, or else we'll just go on skating over these issues and not making progress. So that's what I want to talk about what's at issue. And I think we can all agree that what's at issue is whether or not, when we talk about whether machines or animals have consciousness, we mean something like human consciousness. Otherwise, we wouldn't be asking the questions. It's because we know so well this extraordinary phenomenon which exists inside our heads that we question about where in the world it might also be present. If we didn't have it, it wouldn't occur to us to ask whether a dog or a machine or LLM might be conscious. And so given that it is human-like consciousness, I think we should presumably start by establishing or trying to establish what exactly are the facts in our own case, the facts which we question could be replicated in another organism. And I find it useful to go back to John Locke's definition old definition, but I think a very useful one. Locke defined consciousness by saying, consciousness is the perception of what passeth in a man's own mind. Now, if a mental state doesn't pass in our own minds, it's not conscious, and if it does, it is. So introspective access, which is what he was talking about, introspective access is a necessary and I think sufficient condition for calling it a state of consciousness. So the question is just then, what do we find passing in our own minds? By virtue of what do we count ourselves conscious? Well, let's go back to an example. I wrote a whole book about what's going on here. My book was called Seeing Red, and I looked at all the different ways in which we might talk about the experience, of elementary experience, but it's not so elementary, of seeing a red field like that. But all I want to say now is that, to use an old-fashioned term, what we find when we introspect about what's going on here or in any other experience, what we find are ideas. Or to use a more modern term, what we find are intentional states, mental states that are about something, about the color red, in whatever sense we mean that when we look at that screen. And given that this is a conference about sentience, I want to focus on sensory ideas, in particular sensation and perception. Now, I'm going back again to an old definition of those words. Thomas Reid wrote more sensibly about these issues than any other philosopher I know, and he was writing 200 or 300 years ago, but he hasn't been bettered. Reid insisted throughout his writings that the central issue for discussing the mind and discussing consciousness is to make the distinction between what he called feeling and thought, or between sensation and perception. And he wrote about the senses. The external senses have a double province, to make us feel and to make us perceive. They furnish us with a variety of sensations, some pleasant, others painful, and others indifferent. And at the same time, they give us a conception and an invincible belief in the existence of external objects. He takes the example of smelling a rose, and he says, the agreeable odor I feel when I smell the rose, considered by itself, is merely a sensation. It affects the mind in a certain way, and this affection of the mind may be conceived without a thought of the rose or any other object. Its very essence, the sensation, its very essence consists in being felt, and when it's not felt, it is not. Perception, by contrast, has always an external object, and the object of my perception, in this case, is the quality in the rose that I discern by the sense of smell. I have summarized this. What Ray is saying is there are two takes we have on external objects like that. We experience what's happening to me, how it's affecting me, and what's happening out there, what is publicly occurring and could be shared with other people. To take the example of a tomato rather than a rose, the tomato creates a sensation, a red sensation, which is a subjective experience. We can't be sure if it's exactly the same experience that other people have. But it also, when we look at the tomato, we identify it as having a reflective surface that we call red. That's a physical property, and it's a property we could agree about with other people, and for that matter with physical measuring instruments. Now, let's note that these two types of ideas, sensation and perception, aren't just about different things. They're doing it in a radically different way. Sensations have phenomenal properties, and Keith may say, well, they don't have them, we think they have them, but I'm not going to argue about that at the moment. Keith and I disagree. It's funny with you and I agree about so much, and then when it comes to it, we say, yes, but you're expressing it in the wrong way, and our emails go backwards and forwards about the sentences we're using that we think we're agreeing about the actual content of the thoughts we're having. So sensations have phenomenal properties, or qualia. I'm not going to elaborate on what we mean by that. I think we all know what we mean. And in that respect, sensations are in a class of their own. They're states that have the peculiar quality and a very special quality of its being like something to have them. And I think sensations have this, pains, smells, tastes, etc., have it in a way which no other mental states can be said to have in a serious way. And so the $64 question, of course, is about AI. Do or could machines have access both to conscious sensations and to conscious perceptions? Would they have to have access to sensations with phenomenal qualities to count as being humanly conscious in the way that we care about, the way that matters to us, and which makes us interested, particularly in whether machines also have those experiences? Now, some philosophers would say that that question is another of those bad questions. Perhaps the fact is that, that sensation and perception simply have to go together. You can't have one without the other. Some people even think that's an analytical truth. Well, then I can only say so much for analysis. The empirical fact is that they don't have to go together. As Thomas Reid realized, sensation and perception are independent ways of thinking about the world, and they can be dissociated. Reid wrote back in 1785, "I can conceive of a being that has sensations of various kinds without any perception." And here, notably, "I can conceive also of a being that perceives all that we perceive without any sensation connected with those perceptions." In other words, Thomas Reid can conceive of blind sight. And I'm going to take that as my example of the independence of sensation and perception, the possibility that perception can occur without sensation being present at all. And I've talked about blind sight in this previous meetings here, and many of you will be familiar, but I'm going to go back to it because I don't think we could ever forget the phenomenon when we're trying to think about consciousness. Blind sight is what occurs in humans and in monkeys, we believe, and probably many other mammals, when you remove the visual cortex but leave intact the midbrain visual system. I worked on it 50 years ago, a monkey called Helen, which I studied for 7 years, who'd had her visual cortex completely removed, and which I realized and demonstrated nonetheless had the capacity to use her eyes to perceive the world. I'm going to show you a piece of film. I've recently had this film remastered, and I've been going back to it recently to find out what I had perhaps I'd missed in the earlier analysis. Here is this monkey who has no visual cortex, and there's every reason to think, from reasons I'll come to in a moment, that she has no visual sensations of any sort, that she would say it's not like anything to be me in the visual sphere. Here, I should say, by the way, there's loud noise playing in the background here. She's not using echoing or anything like that. Nonetheless, you can see she quite clearly is able to use her eyes to perceive the world and to make judgment about what lies out there in the world beyond her. But she doesn't have any corresponding experience of vision occurring to her. She does not own the perception. Now, we originally thought that because the human cases like this were discovered by Larry Weiskrantz following on from this research of mine on Helen, initially the patients, they did deny that they had any visual sensations, but they maintained that they had no visual sensations, but nonetheless they could be demonstrated that they were able to visually perceive the world. They could tell where things were, what shape they were, what color they were, what brightness they were, and it seemed that they nonetheless had this perceptual take, which was not being accompanied by sensation. And originally, it was thought it wasn't accompanied by any form of consciousness. It seemed that they didn't have introspective access to their visual percepts. I think that's wrong, and I've been going back over my own work on this, and I'm going to introduce you to some new work. Let's take this example of, here's Helen. I was looking back at this film, and can you believe that this monkey I've slowed it down here a bit, that doesn't know what she can see. Here she is making choices based on visual perception. and this would seem to be behaviorally, obviously, a monkey who knows what she can see. Now, could that also be true of human beings with blind sight? Initially, it was denied. People took their word for it that they didn't know that they had visual perception. But we've recently been looking at a case called Tian. He's a man he's died now, he's a man from Rwanda, who had, like Helen, complete destruction of the visual cortex on both sides of his brain. Had the misfortune to have 2 strokes, one 2 weeks after the other. First got the left side, the next got the right-hand side of his visual cortex. Now, it was found fairly early on, could navigate around the world like Helen did, and would, apparently he knew he could do that. He wasn't surprised by it. We've also recently shown, I'm going to show you a couple of film clips, that he can talk about what he's seeing in a way which was supposed to be impossible for blind sight subjects. Here's a couple of film clips I've made in a visit to Beatrice de Gelder's lab where Tian had come to do some work with her.
Ça, c'est la fleur.
Okay, so here he's been asked whether to identify the color.
C'est ici.
Ouais.
Ah,
Une des 2 est rouge.
oui, c'est ça. C'est ça, non? C'est correct?
Tout à fait.
Ça, c'est rouge.
Oui.
Ça, c'est rouge.
Oui.
Immédiatement, je fais. Parce que ça a brillé directement. Donne-moi encore une fois. Écoute,
This man says he has no visual sensation.
Voilà, c'est rouge.
Yeah,
Voilà.
très bien.
C'est ça, là.
Here he's doing another, identify the color we've asked him.
C'est rouge.
Mais le rouge, c'est ça.
Oui, bien, très
Il
bien.
est faux, hein?
Now, to
C'est
people
ça,
who
merci.
studied earlier cases of blind sight, this would have been astonishing, and I think it is astonishing. I'm going to give you quickly another example of his ability. Here we've asked him to look at the figure on the right, which is just this Johansson dot figure.
Il est en train de marcher, sinon tu vois qu'il bouge.
He's moving.
Il est en train de marcher, je n'ai pas de doute. Là, je vois qu'il marche.
He's right. He's walking to the right. But look, he's walking to the right, but he isn't moving. An extraordinary observation to make. It's a perceptual observation about what's happening in the world, which is quite unexpected. Now, the point I want to make about AI consciousness is that, as cases like blind sight show, we can have conscious access to mental states even in the absence of any phenomenal content. You can see the world without having visual sensations. And that's to say that we can be conscious at 2 levels. I'm going to call it cognitive consciousness or simple Lockean consciousness when we have introspective access to mental states of any kind. I'm only going to call it phenomenal consciousness if we have introspective access to mental states that have or seem to have phenomenal properties. And if this is the case for humans, we should apply exactly the same distinctions when discussing non-human animals or AI. We should say an animal or machine is Lockean conscious if it has introspective access to mental states of any kind. And I think there are many reasons to believe that a vast array of animals have that, and already some machines do. They have introspective access. They can know what's going on in their minds or pseudo-minds. But we should say that the machine or the animal is phenomenally conscious only if there are special reasons for thinking it has access to sensations with phenomenal properties. However, as anyone who reads the current recent literature will know, very few theorists actually honor or abide by this distinction in practice. When it comes to it, the 2 species of consciousness, phenomenal and cognitive, are regularly conflated. Indeed, because phenomenal consciousness has become a much sexier topic than plain cognitive consciousness, theorists increasingly put it at the top of their agenda. Paper after paper starts off with the grand claim that this paper is primarily about phenomenal consciousness. Jonathan Birch, Dave Chalmers, Daniel Seth, you name that. Everyone who writes a review on consciousness starts off in the first or second sentence saying this is primarily about phenomenal consciousness, but then they quietly let it drop. And they go on to talk about the much easier topic of cognitive consciousness. Well, that's especially the case of people like Birch, who are trying to analyze or talk about consciousness in animals. I think that maybe everyone who writes about phenomenal consciousness should be obliged to keep the phenomenon up front in their own current experience. While sitting at their word processor, they should be sucking a lemon, or they should be sitting on a bed of nails. Then they wouldn't forget what it's actually like to have phenomenal consciousness. Now, it's a puzzle in the context of consciousness studies in general, and I think it's worth asking just why people find it so hard, so uncongenial to make this crucial distinction. It's as if they simply can't conceive of cognitive consciousness without there being at least some hint of phenomenal consciousness. At a conference I was at just 2 weeks ago, Eva Jablonka announced that cognitive consciousness entails phenomenal consciousness, logically entails it. Yet as I see it, there's no justification, scientific or philosophical, for this way of looking at things. And I'd say there's every reason to think it's a serious scientific mistake. Keith and I have discussed this, and we actually think it's pretty prevalent. There's something going on here which is preventing people from making this distinction. Now, 200 years ago, the poet Coleridge announced a method for how to come to terms with other people's mistaken theories. You must try to understand how you could have made the same mistake yourself. He called it his golden rule. Until you understand a writer's ignorance, presume yourself ignorant of his understanding. And he explains, I have now before me a treatise of a religious fanatic, full of dreams and supernatural experiences. I see clearly the writer's grounds and their hollowness. I have a complete insight into the causes. And this I can do without suspecting him of any intentional falsehood, as when in broad daylight a man tracks the steps of a traveller who has lost his way in a fog. Even so, and with the same tranquil sense of certainty, can I follow the traces of this bewildered visionary. I understand his ignorance. Coleridge contrasts this with trying to understand the wanderings of Plato in some of his more difficult dialogues. With Plato, he says, he confesses, he simply can't work out where he's coming from. Though therefore utterly baffled in all my attempts to understand the ignorance of Plato, I conclude myself ignorant of his understanding. Well, what I'm about to say is I'm sure going to sound horribly arrogant, but I've reached that point in my life where I don't mind being horribly arrogant. Leonore Bloom tells me she can trump me on this, but we're in our middle 80s, and I think it's time we spoke truth to power, or truth to convention. Anyway, I've been trying to understand the ignorance of most of my colleagues. I don't mean only the bewildered visionaries, the panpsychists, Goff and others, the Mysterians, the dualists, not just those who fall on their knees before what they call the insoluble hard problem. I also mean those who assume the answer to the hard problem will simply emerge as more of the facts about cognition get discovered. The problem isn't that we're dealing with Platonic genius here. I think if we look at the theories in more broad daylight, it's pretty obvious where people are going wrong. It's that they are all in thrall to an idea that has permeated the discussion of consciousness for more than a century. The identity thesis. That conscious states are identical to brain states. That's to say that certain brain events have conscious phenomenal properties built into their physical structure. So when I have a red sensation, for example, I'm accessing something in my brain that has all the properties of phenomenal redness. Now, think about it for a moment. Identity. Neural activity is identical or equals having a red sensation. If this identity weren't so familiar as to have lost its power to shock, we've all been brought up on this. I think if it wasn't so familiar, we'd think of it as utterly bizarre. That's a very strange and peculiar proposition. As Colin McGinn said a long time ago, you might as well try to get numbers from biscuits or ethics from rhubarb. And he said, well, it seems absurd. and that led him to think that, well, that's because he wasn't bright enough to understand it. But it's the kind of identity, it's exactly the kind of identity which many others, in one way or another, quite clearly do believe in, whether it's Ned Bloch or Victor Lamy or Christoph Koch. They're all identity theorists of one sort or another. To give you an example from integrated information theory, here's a quotation from Koch. There is complete one-to-one mapping between any experience and of all of its phenomenal distinctions and relations on the one hand, and the causal structure that is identical to it and that is unfolded from its physical substrate on the other hand. I get the impression that some of these theorists actually revel in the act of faith required to believe something like this. Like the Roman Emperor Tertullian, they believe because it is absurd. Christoph Koch once wrote to me, "Consciousness is such a mystery, it seems to call for God." I can't but be reminded of Nietzsche's riff on Tertullian, "Credo quia absurdus sum." I believe because I am absurd. But I'm here to say that we really don't need this. We don't need acts of faith when there's a perfectly reasonable explanation waiting in the wings. The alternative explanation has been there from the beginning. Locke wrote, "Consciousness is the perception of what passeth in a man's own mind." Consciousness isn't a thing in the way a physical brain state is a thing. Consciousness is indeed a perception, an attitude, an idea. It's the way the brain represents a state of affairs. It's our take on what's happening around us and what we as conscious subjects make of it. And once we see representations as the issue, I think much of the difficulty and mystery falls away. What the science of consciousness has to explain is not how a brain state can be a conscious state, but how the brain as a semantic engine can situate us propositionally as the subjects of particular ideas. I hope I've expressed that right. I'm going to say it again. How the brain as a semantic engine can situate us propositionally as the subjects of particular ideas. We already understand in principle how representations work. They involve a two-stage process. Let's take the red tomato, for example. When perceiving the red color of the skin, there will be, for example, the physical vehicle that carries out the information that carries information about how the brain evaluates the light arriving at the eyes, so as something happening out there. And then there's going to be the cognitive operation that interprets this information as the idea of physical redness. When having the red sensation, on the other hand, there's going to be another physical vehicle that carries the information about how the brain evaluates the light arriving at the eyes as something happening to me. And then there's going to be the cognitive operation that interprets this as the idea of phenomenal redness. But of course, there's neither physical redness nor phenomenal redness in the brain. By analogy, consider a work of literature, say the novel Moby Dick. There will be A, the text that carries the information about the words penned by the author, and B, the cognitive operation that interprets these as a story about a white whale. Again, there's nothing in the physical text that is white or whale-like. Here, let me show it. First, the book. Here's the text, here's the interpretation of it as a story about a white whale. And now the red perception, here's the tomato, here's the interpretation of it as having a color physically red, and that then we attribute that perception to, we have this perception of the tomato, and here's the sensation. A different kind of process which we interpret as being about the color red with its phenomenal properties. As Dan Dennett has put it, the phenomenal quality of a red sensation can be like a discussion, a beautiful discussion of red, just about a color, without itself being colored. So as I see it, we now have several scientifically manageable tasks for understanding phenomenal consciousness. The task for neuroscience is to explain how the human brain achieves this very special kind of representation, precisely how the internal discussion of sensations takes the beautiful form it does, what exactly this is, and then that's the task for neuroscience. And then going beyond humans, the task for evolutionary psychology is to explain what this red sensation is for, what's the adaptive value of having this experience, why was it favored by natural selection. I can't go into that now. Katerina will be talking about this, I think, in the next session. But in one sentence, my own view is that what phenomenal consciousness does for an organism like us or for others, other phenomenally conscious organisms, is to give rise to the existence of a phenomenal self centered around sensation. And what having this phenomenal self does is to change the subject's psychological profile, how the subject conceives of his own life, past, present, and future, and the lives of others like himself or herself. So we have to ask, do the brains of non-human animals also house phenomenal selves? And if they do, why is it psychologically adaptive in the same way as it is for us? And then finally, turning to machines, the task will be to again be of a rather different order. If I'm right about the science here, we can safely say that no machine currently in existence is phenomenally conscious. We don't need tests to discover whether existing AIs are sentient or have phenomenal selves, any more than we need tests to discover whether they are vegetarian or Roman Catholic. As things stand, these simply aren't relevant considerations for machines. Now, that's not to say that phenomenal consciousness might not one day become a relevant issue for machines. I guess so might Roman Catholicism. The time may come when AI engineers decide deliberately to build sentience into their creations, using animal sentience as their model. Why would they do that? Well, it could be that in some circumstances, machines might prove to be more use to us if they were to have a phenomenal self. And so we might decide to give it to them. But of course, it needn't be human engineers, the engineers that do that. Suppose machines are allowed to evolve under their own steam, then it's not impossible they might one day discover sentience of their own accord, if it happened to suit their own lifestyle and selfish interests. I have to say, I think that's actually very unlikely. I believe the evolution of phenomenal consciousness in animals was made possible by a series of lucky accidents that depend on animal biology, and we can be sure that they're never likely to be repeated in a non-living machine. Much more likely, however, is that machines might evolve of their own accord to mimic phenomenal consciousness in order to deceive humans into accepting them as social partners with phenomenal selves. Mimicry is an ingenious strategy that has evolved again and again in animals and plants because of the shortcuts it can provide to undeserved benefits. And most remarkable in this context, and perhaps most worrying as an analogy for what might happen with AI, is the case of the rove beetle. The rove beetle mimics the appearance, odor, and behavior of a particular ant species in order to infiltrate ant colonies and eat the ant's young. This beetle on the right-hand side there is a completely separate genus of animal. It's not an ant, but it's evolved to look and smell like one. I will quote here from the New Scientist, "It's one of the sneakiest ploys that has ever evolved. Rove beetles blend seamlessly into army ant societies, but instead of helping out, they devour the young of their unsuspecting companions. The beetle's entire body shape has evolved to resemble the army ants they prey on. They smell and act like the ants too. They even go marching on raids with them." The parallels with AI are all too obvious, including the fact that they go on marching with raids for us. This kind of sneaky infiltration of human society is undeniably a possibility with AI, actually in the quite near future, and one we should indeed be worried about immediately. So what's the future for AI consciousness? Is it a mirage? Well, I think that AI are already perhaps and could certainly become cognitively consciousness. I think they could become pseudo-phenomenally conscious. They could mimic it, and we know the reasons why that might happen and which we have to guard against. I think at least for the time being, there's no question of their being phenomenally conscious. It's simply not on the horizon. So, thanks.
Welcome, Professor Michael Pauen, Humboldt University of Germany, and he's speaking on ascribing higher cognitive abilities to AI systems.
Yeah, thanks for the introductions. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm doing something that Nick said would be necessary in the time to come, and I think I agree completely. So I don't think it's a very probable that it's probably that AI systems, or that we will be in the situation to ascribe cognitive abilities or higher cognitive abilities to AI systems, at least on the level of sentience. I do think that the question has been raised already if we go to some more mundane cognitive abilities. So the success of DNNs like large language models or object recognition networks has raised questions whether we can, and these questions have already been discussed in the philosophical literature, whether these networks can be used as models for cognitive processes and neural processes in the human brain. One of the reasons is that the large language models kind of passed the Turing test, and there have been discussions whether or not for instance, the large language model can be ascribed some kind of meaning or at least reference. Others have argued that they are just stochastic parrots. So the question, I think, is on the table. I'm not making any speculations as to when or why these systems might instantiate something like sentience or other higher cognitive abilities. My talk is only methodological. So I will only be talking about ways how we can make a reasonable distinction, a reasonable decision or assessment on whether or not we can ascribe these higher cognitive states to AI systems. And I think in some cases, given the discussion today about consciousness in the philosophical literature, some people saying that certain theories are just pseudoscience, or that another famous theory is just based on methodological artifacts. I think we need this discussion in the consciousness debate as well, but I'm going to focus particularly on the AI debate. So I think an epistemological analysis is necessary, and that's what I'm going to do. I think that the ascription of higher cognitive abilities to AI systems is a kind of a measurement. So what we are trying to do is, as we don't have, going back to the methodology of measurement and also the history of the development of measurement systems is of particular interest, because scientists in the past have found themselves very often in the situation where they wanted and they had to improve a measurement technique without having direct access to the measurand. So they tried to improve thermoscopes without knowing exactly what the right temperature was. And they developed methodologies in order to make progress under these conditions. And what I would like to do is I would like to capitalize on these methodologies, on these tricks scientists use in order to improve their methods of measuring a certain property without having direct access to the property. So, and the property in question is, of course, consciousness. Yeah, right. I'll try to avoid this concept for several reasons. I think sentience is a much better concept. We much better and have a much more precise idea of what specific forms of sentience are. I will focus on affective pain sentience. So that is something that we can describe. We have not a definition, but we know what we are talking about, and we have a lot of theories. All this is lacking when we are talking about consciousness. So I think it's a very good idea to focus on sentience. And again, my example will be affective pain sentience. I will talk about what affective pain sentience is in a bit more detail in the third part of my talk. What is important, of course, when we are talking about measurement techniques is validity. So we have to make sure that what we are measuring or what our methodology is measuring is the subject that we want to measure. And in order to make this sure, we need a precise understanding of the target properties in humans on the phenomenal, on the functional, and on the mechanistic level. And that's one of the important points that I will be focusing on. I think this is a point that of agreement, although with Nick and Keith, the previous talks. So now my talk will have 4 parts. In the first part, I'm talking about basic requirements for these measurement techniques and what we can learn from the development of physical measurement techniques. In the second part, I will apply these requirements to current cases, and actually, just for reasons of time, to one case, to object recognition networks. In the third part, I will talk about what effective pain sentience is, and then I'll describe conditions under which we might have reasons to apply or to ascribe effective pain sentience to AI systems. Again, I'm not a fortune teller. I don't know and I don't think that AI systems will have effective pain. I think it's just a good example because we have a precise understanding of effective pain to think about the methodologies that would justify this ascription. Okay. Basic requirements. So first, what I mean when I'm talking about higher cognitive abilities, for me, it's a very, very generic terms. What I mean, examples for what I mean are abilities like object recognition or language understanding, so I don't make a difference between phenomenal and access or cognitive consciousness, emotions, conscious mental states like occurrent belief, cognitive consciousness normally, or sentience, pain experience. When I say it's a case of sentience, I mean this is a way of feeling a certain body state, and I'm focusing on the feeling part of it. Okay, when we look for when we try to specify the requirements that would justify us to ascribe a certain state to an artificial system, and by the way, in most cases to humans and non-human animals as well, we first need a standard. We first have to make sure that we know what we are talking about. And again, that's one of the reasons why I think sentience is a much better point to start with than consciousness. That is, we have to focus first on the corresponding human ability, and we need this human ability as a standard also to explain or to describe differences. So if an artificial system may have a certain human ability, this might differ from us, and the difference can only be explained or described more precisely if we know what the outset is, and that's the standard human ability. When I talk about ascription, I'm not offering a solution. Again, I've already said this. I'm only offering a methodology to develop such a solution, and I'm only giving proofs of principle. I'm not saying that I have this. Okay. Oh, no, wait. What is important in this process of developing is first that this development is a development of a methodology, kind of a bootstrapping process step by step. And particularly relevant in this process is the exclusion of false positives. That is the exclusion of situations in which the methodology that we have ascribes consciousness or ascribes sentience to an artificial system, whereas the system doesn't have sentience. So that's, I think, the most important in the development. What do we need? Well, of course, first we need the phenomenology, particularly if we talk about something like affective pain. That is, we need this phenomenology just in order to know what we are talking about, even if we cannot build on introspective data or on introspective reports by the AI system. That would be obviously a bad idea. The next point that will be needed and that we can get information from the AI system is a functional description. So we have to agree on typical causes and effects on the behavioral, on the cognitive, and the cognitive side is of particularly importance. That is one of the difference between the account I'm suggesting and for instance, traditional consciousness, and on the neural level. So for instance, in the case of pain, one on the cognitive level and even on the phenomenal level, we could say pain is an urge to avoid. It's caused by tissue damage. That's on the behavioral level. It results in avoidance decision and in avoidance learning. And that's again on the cognitive level. What is of particular importance is a focus on those features that are critical for sentience. That is, that let's assume there is non-sentient or non-conscious pain. I don't want to discuss this, just let's assume it for the sake of the argument, okay? So in this case, what we would need are the critical features, particularly on the functional level, that distinguish conscious from non-conscious affective pain. Yeah, these are the critical functional features that we know. For instance, it could turn out that conscious pain enables flexible avoidance learning, while non-conscious pain doesn't. And it also allows for the integration of all relevant information. I'm borrowing a bit from global workspace theory, just as an example. Then, on the second level, we also need a precise understanding of the underlying neural mechanisms. So, for instance, we could say, I mean, this is something that's almost uncontroversial. Pain is based on activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, in the insular and sensory motor areas. Again, what we need particularly to apply this very, very coarse-grained information to sentience is a focus on mechanisms that are critical for sentience. That is, for instance, the neural mechanism underlying avoidance learning, information integration, something like this. Or maybe a specific format of information transfer that comes into effect when the pain becomes sentient. Another important point is that, to some extent, connects to something Nick has said in his talks. I call it idiosyncrasies. So the human brain has developed under very, very specific evolutionary conditions, and the different steps of the brain, each of these steps of the development, have imposed certain contextual conditions or constraints on the next step. Whereas the AI systems are designed from the scratch. So, and that means that it may be that the brain needs specific tricks or specific abilities to perform a certain function which an AI system does not need. So take, again, global workspace theory. Global workspace theory says that we need conscious experience or consciousness for integration of information in the entire brain, on the global workspace. It may be that an artificially designed system doesn't need this. So even if you have exactly the same performance, the artificial system will not have consciousness. So what we need is a strategy, particularly features on the mechanistic level, or knowledge about features on the mechanistic level, that shows that we can rule out that the effect in the human brain, consciousness, is just an idiosyncratic feature that would not show up in an artificial system. Yeah, that's an additional part in order to rule out, an additional requirement in order to rule out false positives. Okay, let's talk about actual cases, how this method can be applied to actual cases. In the interest of time, I focus only on one of them. So, detection of what I would like to show is that this strategy allows for the detection of false positives in this case, object recognition network. The claim at issue is that convolutional neural networks, that is object recognition systems, that match human performance in object recognition are said to be models of the human cognitive system or of the human brain or the visual system. So one of the quotes, I have a number of authors who agree basically with this claim, is the empirical reason why artificial neural networks can be called the current best models of human vision is that they offer unprecedented mechanistic explanations for the human capacity to make sense of complex naturalistic input. Well, how can we test this idea? I think we can test it, and what I use is an object or are object recognition networks that match human performance understanding conditions. So that is, no, sorry. That's standard input. And on this kind of inputs, the blue ones are the artificial neural nets, have the same performance or even slightly better performance than humans. Does this mean that they use the same cognitive strategies? Well, there is suspicion that it does not mean, because we know from psychological studies from the 1980s that humans have a preference for shape. So let's look how the artificial systems perform if we take a stimulus, if we take only shape. So humans perform almost at ceiling also if you present them with this stimulus, but the performance of the artificial system breaks down. So and if you take ambiguous stimuli, so what the artificial system uses, or what they prefer, is texture. So if you take, and that is shown by another experiment that uses functional information to detect false positive. The false positive is the assumption that the artificial system has the same cognitive process as the human brain. And that is an ambiguous stimulus. What you have here is the texture of an elephant and the shape of a cat. What the artificial systems do, they classify it as an elephant, and while human, obviously, as you probably do, classify it as a cat. And again, so that's functional information used to detect false positive. That's the basic idea. That's a basic principle of what I've suggested. Okay, so the consequence is that functional descriptions related experimental manipulation that using stimuli that focus on this functional difference can show that identical performance doesn't indicate identical cognitive processes. That's the bottom line. Okay, now let's look how this can be applied to artificial sentience in artificial systems. And as I've already said, I take the example of affective pain. I would say what this is in a minute. Kind of a caveat, the examples so far were comparatively uncontroversial cognitive abilities that we think it is at least possible that AI systems may have these abilities. They show that the methodological requirements can help to identify false positives in these cases. Sentience in AI is far beyond current development. Yeah? So I'm not saying that this will be realized anytime soon. However, keep in mind, if we had the conference, let's say 4 years ago, and we would have discussed about passing the Turing test, or maybe 5 years ago, I don't know what the computer scientists would have said 5 years ago, let's say 10 years ago, I don't mind. We would have said this won't happen in our lifetime. Yeah? So let's look what the future has. So again, philosophers are bad fortune tellers. I'm not making any claims. I'm just looking at the methodology. And my claim will be that the methodological requirements I've mentioned in the first part are useful for sentience as well. And I use pain as an example. In case of pain, we normally tend to think, or maybe most of you don't tend to think this anymore, but just for to be sure, so pain actually exists or consists of two different systems, an effective motivational system and a sensory system that differ regarding phenomenality, function, and neural mechanisms. I'm not making any pre or post-Cartesian claims about the phenomenological character of pain. I assume most of you have felt pain, and sometimes bad pain. So that's the only claim I make. Okay, so the sensory system, if the sensory system is active, then you feel the intensity and the sort of tissue damage that you have. Yeah? And the sensory system is a distinct system that can be dissociated and sometimes is dissociated in a clinical condition like pain symbolia from the affective pain system. The affective pain system or affective motivational system is responsible on the phenomenal level for the affective motivational character, and it will be the focus of the present talk. Let's describe it in a bit more detail. On the phenomenal level, we can say that pain, the badness of pain, is just an urge to avoid. Not an urge to avoid on the behavioral level, on the cognitive level. That means that you have an urge to make a decision to avoid this. You may be a masochist and finally decide to look for pain, but for different reasons. On the functional level, pain is, again, that can also be, the disposition to avoid is also something on the functional level that I think should show you that there is no contradiction between a phenomenal description and a functional description, but that would be subject of another talk. Important, the functional relevance becomes effective particularly in decision making, very wide concept of decision making. It becomes indirectly effective in behavior. And it enables, and that is important, flexible behavior and learning. There's a huge body of evidence for this. The most important one is a study by Battier and others from the end of the 1980s. They had patients with pain asymbolic. They only had effective pain. And the important point is that these patients did not avoid pain. Very, very strong stimuli. Sometimes they even approached pain. These patients also did not engage in pain learning, so they did not learn to avoid pain stimuli. So that shows something about the functional character of pain, the role of effective pain for pain learning or pain avoidance related learning. And there is also evidence particularly for one aspect of effective pain, namely that it includes integration of information from different sources, that this is also an important part of the function of effective pain. So that I borrowed this from the global workspace theory, as already said. Now, let's talk about the neural level. On the neural level, you have activity in the anterior cingulate cortex. There's a lot of activity from lesion studies with hypnosia, and more recently, optogenetic studies. Lesions in the anterior cingulate cortex lack in avoidance behavior, lack of avoidance learning, and lack of effective pain experience. So you have this analogy on the phenomenal, functional, and physical level. Optogenetic studies reveal the role, or reveal more details about the role of the SCC neurons in effective pain sentience and pain learning. For instance, if you turn on certain neurons in the effective, in the anterior cingulate cortex, then you avoid situations where you would never have felt pain. Just turning on these neurons is sufficient for avoidance learning. So that gives you a bit of detail about what's happening there. Now, let's apply this to, and that's the last part. How much time do I have left?
10 minutes.
10? Oh, that's more than sufficient. Okay, great.
Sorry, with the questions, sorry.
With the questions.
With the questions.
Oh, so then nothing is left. Okay, that makes a difference. Okay, so I try to speed to some extent to this last part because it's the most important. Okay, let's apply this. So let's look what we have to change, what we have to change or what we have to add to the present knowledge in order to be able to apply this to artificially intelligent systems. So what we already know is that effective pain is essential for avoidance learning and for relevant information integration. This knowledge has already been used for a behavioral paradigm that is used in animal and also in human research. That's the conditioned place aversion. So that's a behavioral proxy for effective pain. And what the behavior capitalizes, or what the paradigm capitalizes on, is that if you have a rat, the rat is administered pain, an effective pain stimulus in a certain environment, then the rat will avoid this environment. And that is important because it shows, and only if the rat has had effective pain sentience. So it's critical for effective pain sentience. What is important is it's a piece of learning. The rat learns to avoid this. And it's also a case of information integration because the rat remembers the specific features of this room and will avoid rooms of this sort. And that happens with humans and with fish, for instance, as well. So the paradigm shows that you have had effective pain, which includes information integration and the conditioning process. And there is other information of conditioning processes that go into the same direction. Okay, yeah, what is good about the paradigm that the underlying neural mechanism is fairly well understood. I've already mentioned it, and it is supported by additional evidence for sentience being a requirement for flexible learning and trace conditions. By experiment by Clark and Squire, there is a conditioned learning process between an acoustic stimulus and, I don't know, some kind of retraction process. And if there is an interval between the acoustic stimulus and the unconditioned behavior, then this works only if the stimulus is heard consciously. Yeah? You need sentience in order to condition upon with a stimulus that has a distance from the unconditioned behavior. So now, what we need in order, what the requirements are in order to apply this conditioned place aversion to AI systems is first a better understanding of the role of sentience in the learning mechanism. That means on the functional level, we need more details about the functional differences between sentient and non-sentient pain. Why is it the case that in the case of non-sentient pain, we have an absence of a learning process, or an absence of a conditioning process, maybe an absence of specific kinds of learning processes? Why do we have an absence of information integration in these cases? What kind of so if we would know all the details, all these details would allow us to exclude false positives and to make this paradigm more specific. What is also important is including idiosyncrasies. So is sentience in humans necessitated for information integration only because of specific idiosyncrasies of the human brain which do not hold for artificial systems? That has to be excluded as well. In this case, it would not be necessary in AI systems. Finally, on the neural level, we would have to understand in much more precision the neural mechanism enabling sentient state to initiate learnings. For instance, one explanation could be, I mean, think of Victor Lamme's recurrent loop theory, or also of a global workspace. Recurrent loops may keep the activity in the brain for a certain time. That is something that you certainly could initiate in artificial systems without consciousness. Then we also, and it would also be good, it would be possible if we have a fairly precise understanding of the mechanism which would enable us to figure out which parts or which details of the mechanisms are, of the actual mechanism are not necessary. So there could be different in AI systems. So that would make the transfer much easier and much better to understand. Okay, current situation, we have initial evidence helping us to understand the learning process from the optokinetic studies I've already mentioned, and we know that sentience is relevant in other cases of conditioning. So this means that it seems that we can make progress meaning we can develop the mechanism or the methods that we have for measuring sentience in AI systems far above the current level, even if we don't have first-person access to the variable that we want to measure, namely first-person experience. Okay, I leave the caveat aside because I've already said this. The only thing I might mention is, so I make no prediction that I've already said. I only try to show how we can develop a method. I'm not saying that this method is the ultimate. We may need something completely different. I'm only trying to sketch out the steps and the methods that we can use in order to make this further development. I would also say that if an artificial system would have a pain system, I don't know which reasons could make technicians or engineers implement a pain system. It would have to be, it wouldn't come by fortune, it would have to be implemented intentionally. And one reason may be that a pain analog may provide an autonomous system with an efficient method that balances damage prevention with other goals.